Great. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. This is Bright Blue's oral evidence session for our Conservatism and Human Rights project, which is a year-long project where we're collecting evidence from experts, both written and oral today, to feed into our policy thinking when we produce a final report from the Commission. Some of the commissioners are here today in 2017. So who's interviewing today? We've got Dominic Grieve, QC MP, who is the chair of the Intelligence Select Committee in the House of Commons, and is one of the commissioners. Myself, I'm the director of Bright Blue. We have Dame Caroline Spelman, who was former Environment Minister and is now Second Estate Church Commissioner. And we have Nigel Fletcher as well, who is our head of research. And different commissioners have been coming in at different points today, but we have our four for your session, which will be on LGBT issues. Just to say that you are acting obviously as independent experts, so this is being filmed, it's being tweeted, there'll be a transcript of your comments in the final report, but obviously we make clear that you don't necessarily endorse our findings, that you are independent, so just to make that clear. Perhaps we can start, if you could just introduce yourselves, that would be particularly useful. So we'll start with Jane.
Is this a 3-minute introduction or the...
Sorry, just introduce yourselves.
Jane Fay, I'm a journalist, a writer, and sort of here in association with Transmedia Watch today.
Thank you.
Ruth Hunt, and I'm Chief Executive of Stonewall, which is the LGBT charity in Great Britain.
I'm Suki, Sandhu, and I'm the founder and CEO of Outstanding, which is a membership organisation for LGBT leaders and allies.
Great. So because of time issues, we're going to go straight into asking questions. So if you have prepared introductory remarks, thank you very much for that, and thank you for the time, but please try and weave those into the answers to the questions that we give. So Ruth, so obviously the coalition government introduced legislation around same-sex marriage, legalising that, and generally social attitudes look like they're going in a positive direction. There's much more freedom and respect and tolerance for the LGBT community. Is that your view?
There are sections of society that are increasing their acceptance of lesbian and gay people at quite a nice, consistent rate. What we're seeing is that there are pockets of discrimination that remain, particularly amongst those who are most vulnerable, particularly trans people, those who are from low-income backgrounds, those who do not work for big organisations are still not being afforded the same rights and responsibilities that you'd necessarily see in larger, more established communities. So although there is a real sense that there's lots done, and from a legislative point of view in relation to sexual orientation, we're certainly one of the most comprehensive systems and legislatures in the world, notwithstanding Northern Ireland and its little preoccupation with marriage. Gender identity, we're way behind the curve now in terms of trans, and I'm sure Jane will talk about that more. But I think one of the strategic concerns Stonewall has from a parliamentary point of view is the protecting of those rights and responsibilities, particularly with increasing discussions about conflicting freedoms, discussions about whether certain organisations, individuals can have opt-out around laws around LGBT people. And we're very, very mindful that Section 28 came out of nowhere without any kind of particularly hostile anti-gay agenda and was slotted into a bill that had nothing to do with sexual orientation. So we're not complacent, and we certainly take heart from our collective success over the last 27 years, but lots to do.
And so thinking about children and young people and their attitudes, particularly within schools, some of the evidence we've received from the written evidence is there's a lot of homophobic bullying which is still present. Yeah. Is that a kind of majority concerning thing, or is it a minority of people who are kind of engaging in that type of bullying?
I think that what we're seeing is a steady trend that schools who engage in the issue of addressing homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying and generally address issues of respect, treating each other well, how we ensure that others are protected. And I was speaking last night to the Conservative Forum on Education about sex education, so not about LGBT but about general sex education. The reality is a lot of our systems are set up for the year 2000, which predates Pornhub, frankly. So there is a greater pressure to teach young men how to respect young women and not learn about that through very adult sites. So what we're seeing is schools are slow to catch up with some of the ways in which young people are learning about different sexuality and diversity and using that as a weapon to hurt. I would say at this point that Nikki Morgan, and this has been affirmed by Justine, has made one of the most comprehensive investments in tackling homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying in quite some time. Stonewall is currently in a position where we can offer free support to 500 faith schools, and Stonewall has done a lot of work targeting those most vulnerable and most hard to reach schools, faith schools, schools in rural areas. We're about to work with a Church of England school in the Isle of Wight, for example. So again, there are schools who are doing very well and there are schools who are being left behind. But we've just trained a Catholic head teacher who has trained every Catholic teacher in his diocese about how to tackle HBT bullying. So these things are still prevalent, but actually we know what works now, which is what we didn't know a decade ago, and we are beginning to see changes.
Okay, thank you. Did any of the commissioners have questions relating to those points?
No, I think that's very helpful. I'll come in a moment.
Okay. So Jane, perhaps I can... so Ruth was highlighting that there are trans issues and still a lot of discrimination and prejudice towards the trans community. Do you feel that there's been a rise recently in attacks towards the trans community? Is it getting worse for the trans community, or is it getting better?
I think it's patchy, and I think exactly as Ruth was saying, that there's a lot of broad general progress, but there has, and sometimes I'm very wary because I'm a journalist, so because people phone me up and tell me all the bad news, but I have never heard the sort of things I've been hearing the last few months. It has been quite staggering and very, very upsetting. I was going to say in introduction, but it seems to me there's two sorts of things going on. One is systemic, and actually a lot of the systemic problems that transgender people face are, as a friend of mine puts it, just one more effing thing. Just being trans and the barriers from documentation you've got to provide to people who spend every other week losing their credit card because someone at the end of the phone decides that their voice doesn't sound feminine enough or something like that. That needs addressing, and it needs addressing in a framework which says simply not we want special rights, but we want just to be able to live like everybody else without extra barriers. And a lot of those barriers are nothing to do with being, they are to do with being trans, they're actually to do with gender. I mean, we'll come back probably to things like Gender Recognition Act, but a lot of the issues and a lot of the call is because people think that you have to have a gender in order to have rights. I'm perhaps, when I discussed this with Ruth in the past, I'm perhaps slightly different, but I say perhaps if we took gender out of the equation, certainly in the last Parliament there was talk about taking away, the army doesn't need gender on its warrant cards, why do we need gender in so many places? So systemic is one side of it. The other, and I'm afraid I think there's been a quite disgraceful concerted attack, and it seems to come from two angles. There's a very odd coalition of what I would call reactionary or Christian right, and apologies, I mean I follow a faith as well, but there are elements within the Christian faith that are determined that trans and LGBT in general shall not advance, and we're seeing this on the internet through organisations like Citizen Go, massive petitioning organisation which has its roots with a Spanish organisation, which in turn bizarrely links back to a Mexican paramilitary organisation, Militant Catholicism. So there is a very concerted attack, and we've seen it in the papers recently, attacking transgender children, and that links up in some spaces with some quite extreme views on the other side of the spectrum, and they are very directed and they are getting in the way. And just to underline that, particularly with trans children, I have been speaking to a large number of parents of trans children over the last 2 weeks following, you may be aware there was some controversy in the papers, parents who are now afraid in this country to take their children outside. They won't do it because people will stop them in the streets. And what seems to have happened, and you can analyse it from whatever way you want to analyse it, what seems to have happened is something has been empowered in the reactionary side of politics. And so whereas before people would say, I don't like that, but I won't say anything, they now feel empowered to come up and say, that child is not right. So It's systemic, but it's also a rise of something else which seems quite dangerous.
Very interesting. So on to Suki. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the sort of progress in terms of employment around the LGBT community and what else you feel that needs to be done.
Yeah, I think in the business context, when it comes to LGBT, I think the challenge we face is that a lot of companies, when we meet, say, the board or senior HR or HR leaders, is generally they seem to think that because we've had equal marriage, for instance, in the UK, the job's done, everything's fine for LGBT people. But actually, when you look at it through the lens of business, it's a very different story when you've got things, statistics like 62% of openly gay graduates at university go back into the closet when they start their first job, or 90% of trans people have experienced harassment or discrimination at work. And I think there was a statistic also that people that are in the closet, they are 70% more likely to leave the company within 3 years of joining if they can't be themselves in business. So I think the challenge is trying to get people to understand actually these issues do exist and they actually have to do something about it. So the way that we tend to work with them is we're very big on showcasing role models and leaders that are out in business at the very top, because I feel that they set the tone for culture and the organisation generally. And we have a media partnership with the Financial Times where we publish a power list of the top 100 LGBT leaders. Here is this year's list in here. I don't know if you guys get a chance to read it, but it's there. Which is also fantastic because the list itself, this year we reached almost 500 million people globally across all our online and print media. So we're firmly trying to put LGBT inclusion on the map globally and getting people to talk about it. Because even people in those lists, collectively, those companies employ about 7 million people globally. So if they're all celebrating this one individual that's in that list, who is there for a reason because they're driving inclusion in their company, we're reaching 7 million people in business talking about this issue. So I think the challenge is very much reminding them of the issues that businesses face, but actually trying to do something about it. Because I think the big focus in business has always been around gender, which I think is really important. I'm a huge feminist myself and I believe in gender diversity, but diversity is more than women. It's also LGBT, it's also ethnicity, it's disability, and it's trying to bring in all the different strands, which I think is really important. And if you get LGBT inclusion right, it benefits everyone, not just LGBT people in the company. So it allows the working mum to come to work to talk about her children without fearing missing out on a promotion. It allows someone who might be a primary carer to talk about who they are looking after. So it's important that we're trying to work together more with the other strands as well.
Can I come in on just a couple of things which I thought were interesting? I mean, clearly, one thing is identifying what the problems are, and then the second thing is, are there legal changes that we need to do to try and address some of those problems? Obviously aware of your views on the Human Rights Act, and the ones I share. We're completely on the same wavelength about that. So the question from my point of view is, should we be doing, if we were to have a Bill of Rights, leaving aside it would have to be completely compatible with the European Convention, is there something else we should be doing or including within it as part of a UK Bill of Rights? That then brings me to Jane's comment, which is about taboos. And as I understand it, the concern that certainly in the last few months has manifested itself against trans people, but it's come in other areas, people have suddenly vocalised suppressed views, which have previously been sort of expunged out, and perhaps leaving us with the mistaken idea that they didn't think these things, but they've suddenly become disinhibited in expressing them. And that raises a big conundrum, because it seems to me that when one looks at the lesbian and gay community, the change which you've been talking about, partly pushed by legislation, obviously big changes in the 60s, but actually a societal change of attitude and approach that transcends law. It's about a change in human mindset which has led to this opening up. So what should we do about trans people? Should we be, in the light of all this, thinking that we ought to be legislating, or is it an educational issue? How do you view that? or indeed, and it applies right across the spectrum of all the things that you've been raising, not just for right across the LGBT community.
I mean, I think if we were not on a being well recorded, transcribed moment, I would be more frank, if I'm honest. I think that the legislation that exists hasn't achieved the right outcome that was intended by the Macpherson report, or by the positive discrimination, or by positive action. So there is a fundamental existential question to be asked of the equalities industry and sector about how do we achieve change. Now, because LGB in particular, were last to the party on the public duty, we've never relied on it. So if you look at the Workplace Equality Index, that works on the basis of reward, not punishment, and celebrates success, and we shout about the top 100, and we don't really tell anybody except the company involved if they're underperforming. MI5 got top of that index, despite the fact that up until 15 years ago, LGBT people weren't even allowed to serve in the security services. And the reason why they've got there is because they've made a fundamental connection with their vision, mission and values, i.e. we need to keep the country safe, and a need to have people on their workforce who can help them keep the country safe. They haven't come at this from an angle of, well, I think we should probably introduce a positive action programme that enables us to level the playing field. So I think that some of those mechanisms, very, very well intentioned in their development, has led to a frozen middle in a lot of the organisations we work with. So there's a whole generation now who are approaching senior management positions, who have spent the first 10 years in their career being told what they're not allowed to do, what they're not allowed to say, and what is not permitted in general course of things. So I don't think any of the changes in the political structure, either here or in America, has suddenly led to people changing their mind. It's just led them to start speaking. So Stonewall's approach in terms of campaigns, I mean, our change model likes legislation, of course, and in the trans, the legislation's doing harm. So it's not about using legislation as a means of changing attitudes, it's about a means of enabling trans people to be themselves and live their lives with a more limited state intervention, and I'm sure Jane will speak more on that better than I can. But there is something about, if we are going to pursue this route of gesture politics, of scrapping the Human Rights Act in order to pursue a British Bill of Rights that still abides by the ECHR, and if we're going to do it, then let's actually think very differently about how we approach inclusion. And Stonewall rarely uses the term diversity, doesn't talk about equality, but talks about people being able to be themselves and contribute to the best of their ability where they live, work, socialise, play and pray. And that is actually what it's about and how we make society work.
Okay, yes, I absolutely would echo that. I'm not, I spent a lot of my life writing about the law, for which reason I'm not very much in favour of legal solutions to things. I had a run-in with a company about 18 months ago. I was treated very badly. I took it up and I eventually talked to their company lawyer, who informed me that a lawyer had looked at their processes, and as their processes were fully compliant with Equalities Acts, I wasn't treated badly. You can see how that goes. I also wrote a few years back a piece which was almost saying, can we scrap a lot of discrimination legislation because it's too categorical. It's too much saying, are you in this category, are you in that category? And of course, problems are problems of intersections, where people sort of fall betwixt and between categories, or they even not recognise things like non-binaries, intersex people and so on. So there's people who fall out with the law. And what we seem to be doing is two things. One is building an edifice where we add more and more. The law is badly treating someone, so let's put something on top of that, and oh, that doesn't work, so let's put something on top of that, and it's becoming unmanageable, which is also giving ammunition to the people who don't like, because they don't like being told what not to do. They're seeing the law as a very prohibitive mechanism. And one particular area, two particular areas, it's around documentation. Since war on terror, since the idea of drugs and money laundering, banks have been told to prove people's identity, and that goes very much to the roots of the problem for trans people, because it is leading to the introduction of a doctrine in English law that you now have a legal name. Of course, there is no such thing in English law, but ask the public, and they now think that there is a legal name, but you need a deed poll to change it, and there's a whole raft of bureaucracy, and there is a multi-million-pound industry.
I've noticed this. I've had cases of constituents with passport issues which has staggered me, just in relation to people who commonly use their maiden name.
Yes.
And being told that it would, the passport office telling them that they should change it because it raises security. Because
Yes.
I was quite astonished.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I've just talked over you. Apologies for that, but it's that sort of thing. It's actually changing centuries of legal doctrine. It's bringing an attitude because of security and so on. And the same sort of thing is happening with gender, because I've certainly heard one lawyer argue that the only people in this country with legal gender are those who've got a Gender Recognition Act. In fact, nobody else has a legal gender, because there's no such thing in British law. So we're moving to a situation where everything has to be tick-boxed and proven, and your rights depend upon which box and which so on. Whereas in fact, what I would like to see, and maybe it's a bit very blue skies, but perhaps I'm the right place for that, is a situation where if you are discriminated against for an irrational motive, then there is some remedy at law for that discrimination, which would then actually allow people who are discriminated against because they've got ginger hair to access the law, and it would allow non-binary people and it would allow intersex people all to be able to come within the scope of the law, rather than saying category, 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 category. So,
could I ask a question about the intergenerational divide, which seems to be quite pronounced? I mean, I agree with Dominic's analysis that at some point in our history as a society, we decided to try and tackle the homophobia in schools, and quite right too. I was shocked to find, that my children had learned, this in the playground without at all understanding what they were talking about, which was a really depressing thing. So we decided there wasn't a point at which we decided we're going to tackle it. It seemed to happen in a way. But what disturbs me was when we were dealing with the same-sex marriage legislation, which I voted in favour of, there was a clear intergenerational divide, because undoubtedly that shift occurred in the education process. And so my children are much more tolerant than previous generations have been, because we've set about trying to address it. But I'm slightly worried about the turn of events. I thought it was a powerful word Dominic used, the disinhibition, which has been very marked in the last 6 months. And just would quite like to get your sense of that intergenerational conflict that we have, how it might be resolved, and whether you think, in fact, we're going backwards or we're going forwards with this cultural change.
I don't think it's as clear-cut as an intergenerational analysis might suggest, and it's quite seductive to think this too shall pass. That analysis makes us think that we'll be all right in the end. What we're seeing, what disturbed me is we did a bit of quick, dirty polling about what young people thought if their favourite footballer came out, and young people would stop supporting that player if they came out. So there is something about the context in which people are thinking about these issues. School is an ongoing project, and it took a long time. I mean, when I started at Stonewall in 2005, schools didn't want to mention gay at all, except in relation to 16-year-olds who might be thinking about their sexuality, but we all know it's a phase, isn't it? It's taken a long, long time. And we still face a lot of resistance from pockets, and not just necessarily faith-based, actually, but a kind of real anxiety about talking about some of these issues. So it's a bit push and pull. We think it's an ongoing project, and if we get there, we kind of get there. The issue is that nobody's done any focus really on older people, because we kind of presume that this will pass, so, whatever. And we knew that marriage was always going to be a lightning rod issue for lots of different things. I think that there is a general cultural complacency about diversity and equality that has set in, that means that some of the disinhibition that's now happening has come as a surprise to everybody involved. If you look at somewhere like on record, if you look at a major employer like the Met Police, for example, this is on record, who disinvested quite heavily in their diversity function and have now had to think very carefully about some of the things that have emerged from that are a matter of record, and you might want to look into it, is indicative of that it's not a one-stop shop, some of this work. It does kind of take some going in and going out. But the emphasis on older people has been lacking. What we're now finding, though, is that people are concerned about ageing and getting older, and the care they're going to receive from social care providers when they're in a position of vulnerability and don't have the luxury of being able to choose a pro-gay friendly care worker or a pro-gay care home and every month I get a bright young thing who's got an idea about setting up a gay nursing home as this is a genius solution. But I don't want to live with my exes, do you know what I mean? I mean, the answer is not gay nursing homes. The answer is to make sure that everybody's okay. So I think that the issue is about institutional responses to making sure people can perform. And football is a really good example of where they've really struggled with this. They still struggle with ethnicity. And this should be a context where what good looks like is really unequivocal. You know, in the days when we were talking about productivity of making buttons, we could talk about productivity in a different way. The productivity of Barclays Bank is quite hard to quantify. Could Barclays Bank be able to demonstrate that the diversity initiatives they've put in has made a difference to their bottom line? Or is it just part of their CSR strategy? Part of the frustration that I've had over the last decade is that none of us have ever been able to prove an unequivocal, robust economic business case for diversity. Except you look at somewhere like Sports Direct, compared with somewhere that does diversity well, there's a reputational issue sometimes at play. But there's no good economic grounding that has an impact on the bottom line.
I mean, the kind of... I've seen it.
I have seen that.
In relation to gender, maybe.
Gender and race, yeah. I know McKinsey did some research where I think they showed a causal link between return on investment was likely to be higher if they had higher gender diversity or ethnic diversity. I don't think it's ever been any research from an LGBT perspective.
Suki, can I just ask around, so there seems to be consensus actually across all groups around, the legislative framework is there, but there's, it's about enforcement and interpretation and enactment. So just thinking about some of the businesses that are, we talk about diversity initiatives and you talked about the kind of top 100 list. What are the other positive things that the kind of leaders in this field do to really improve diversity in workforce and attitudes to LGBT people?
I think there are some really key things that some companies are really good at. And it kind of follows up from what we said about the investment that companies make when it comes to diversity and inclusion. So, for instance, investing in employee resource groups, I think are essential to creating environments where their different communities within their business can meet in safe spaces, be it LGBT, BAME, women, for instance, but actually giving them some funding so that they can actually set up some events, maybe get in some speakers, they can share stories. I think that's hugely powerful.
Yeah.
I think there's definitely a piece around sharing the tone from the top, from the CEO itself. So we did some research of the FTSE 100 annual reports, and I think 43 of them made no reference to LGBT in their definition of diversity. And these were companies that are supposed to be inclusive and diverse, yet their own annual report didn't even reference LGBT itself. So I think when the CEO makes a statement around diversity, but offering diversity in its broadest sense, I think that sends a really clear message to the rest of the workforce that they're feeling included. And if they include LGBT, it's going to make them more attractive as an employer brand to other diverse communities, because they're going to, women are going to think, well, if LGBT people are going to be respected, then so will women. So it has kind of a positive knock-on effect.
Is there evidence to support that? I'm interested, you've said that twice actually, which is if there's a kind of general thrust towards diversity, for example, for women, it has a knock-on effect for other groups as well, like LGBT and ethnic minorities. Or is that just what you've observed?
I think it's more, observing it. So, for instance, I know when the CEO of Lloyds Banking Group, for instance, a few years ago made an announcement that he wanted to hire more women into their leadership. It was all over the press, and it got lots of coverage. There were a lot of women in our network that came to us, obviously wanting to go forward to Lloyds, but also a lot of other different diverse communities like ethnic minorities and LGBT, and the fact that their CEO was making such a public stance at that time, which was probably about 3 years ago, and that's why I think it kind of rallies diverse communities together, I think, more than anything. It makes it more attractive for them.
We're also seeing our top performing companies think much more about their diplomatic influence on international communities, and that is certainly something that Barclays, EY, IBM, Pinsent Masons and Citi are things that we discuss in detail about how they can best use economic diplomacy and their power within countries to start changing attitudes. And I think that's what I mean about a reverse of our change model. And it's a bit around trans, really. So on LGB, we looked to the law first, and then attitudes followed, is the theory in a nutshell. But actually, trans and Barclays is much further ahead on trans inclusion than our current government is. And I think the change will come actually from pressure from our corporations in terms of that cultural change. That's very exciting for Stonewall, because that's a real opportunity to influence in a whole different way.
There's been great resistance to the idea of having quotas, to get the diversity. But actually, some of your best practice companies you're referring to have chosen to have quotas to drive it. 30%, sometimes calling for 30% diversity on a short list for any key appointment. I mean, it does drive change. I'm not taking any official line. That's my personal view and observation. Actually.
But those targets tend to be focused on women. So
yes, but your point's right though, because what I've heard is that companies that go for 30% or 40% diversity on any shortlist attract other groups to feel that this is a company that understands that they need to make the mix.
Yeah.
But I think that depends on how those quotas work. So I think they would describe it as targets, not quotas, quite carefully. But I think that what we find, where we know that there has been quotas, for example, in Labour women's shortlisting, where you've only had, it generally does not lead to a return of anything other than white middle-class heterosexual women. So, there's something about quotas that doesn't actually address the fundamental problem you have with attracting people who... So we talk a lot about affinity bias in Stonewall. People employ people who look like them, think like them, work like them, and can get you in one sentence. And affinity bias. And if you look at any initiatives in politics around quotas, you're actually not changing the nature of politics at all. Question mark. That's the kind of...
Well, it's a question back to me, and I would say... I learned from my Labour colleagues when we were looking at shortlist, the whole, women-only shortlist. Women-only shortlist had a perverse incentive for the women who came into Parliament, that they experienced negativity at the local level, because in effect the selectorate had been deprived of choice. That's sort of a step too far. But if you go for 50-50 mix, so you're just aiming to have much more mix, it opened the way to more gender mixing, race mixing, and the complexion began to change. I think Jane's point is very salient about gender. I remember wanting to take away the male-female designation on our application list because the discrimination against women was so strong at that point. But you have to also then take the name away, because that's a kind of a giveaway. But it's very interesting that when you do that, then you're focusing much more on the people's background and skills and suitability for the job. It has that effect.
Jane, can I just ask around kind of progress for the trans community? Are there examples of good employers and good practices which support and include trans people? I think Ruth mentioned Barclays.
Yeah.
Are there any others?
Clearly there are. I mean, there are some major companies, I better not say a name because they may not actually do this and then I'll be in trouble for saying it, but certainly one major financial institution which will support people in getting medical treatment and so on. And that is very, very positive, because when you look at the investment in the senior manager, you don't want them just walking away because they can't get some sort of support. It's a strange mix. At one point, I mean, I still do this. I write very much about technology and the law, and I try to talk about how companies could future-proof themselves on gender, which basically it's a technical thing. But instead of having tick boxes or fixed fields where you have Mr., Miss, Mrs. or whatever, you actually allow for free format, which in computer terms in some companies is a big change. And I was saying this back in 2010, start changing now, because gender will become more complex and more difficult. Some companies now have done that, although some of course have just added extra boxes which only half solves the problem, and others have gone to free format, which means yes, we can open up. So there are certainly amongst larger companies islands which are spreading out of very good practice of. I've rarely encountered any major discrimination in terms of employment. For a while, before I returned fully to journalism, I did consultancy work, and I was warned basically, you used to do work which involved Saudi Arabia. Don't bother, because you're either gay, in which case you're in trouble, or you're a woman, in which case you can't talk to them. And I didn't win either way. But no, large companies are very good. What I'm more concerned with is the treatment of customers, of stakeholders, and so on. I think companies are quite good at treating their own staff, big companies. But it's the stakeholder thing. It's not understanding how a standard process, and very often you hear this, well, it's the same for everybody. Yes, but it impacts trans people a lot more, particularly around documentation. Could I just add two very quick things in? One is, back to disinhibition, that I've never been a fan of the political process, because in this country at least it's a very top-down process. I've always been hearts and minds up from the bottom, and I think one needs to win people to the argument by showing good practice and showing that we're not dangerous. And the other is perhaps a plea from the sort of transmedia website, that there was something quite good being proposed by Lord Leveson, and it is bit by bit being shredded. And when I talk about the trans children thing, that was very much an attack by part of the media over the last week, and we're shocked to find my former partner, they were saying that they were just talking to an ordinary person. So my former partner knows lots and lots about transgender stuff, and was having repeated back at them a particular myth about trans children, about 8 out of 10 detransition, which is mythological. It's very, very poor research and has been debunked over and over. And yet the national press love to repeat that, and that's become a core of the attack. So the media do have a role to play. And sorry, I've just sidelined it. Sorry.
Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to come to an end now, but perhaps very briefly, you could just, what we're trying to do is hoover up policy ideas so we can propose in our commission what more government can do. So if there's one or two things which you really like to see, which you're very passionate about, what would that be? And if you could be brief, that would be great. So we'll start with Suki.
I'm not so sure in terms of specific policies. That's probably more Ruth's territory rather than mine, I would say.
Don't worry about it.
But for my only comment would be around the big issue I find, because we meet a number of FTSE 100 or FTSE 250 CEOs and chairmen to talk about the D&I business case, and actually a lot of them are most of the time open-minded, but I mean sometimes when I'm sat in a meeting, I'll talk about, I'll say the word lesbian, I say the word gay, you can actually physically see them shudder slightly, and I know in his head he's thinking, did he just say lesbian? And I'm in my head thinking, I did just say lesbian, I'm going to say it even more slowly, because I kind of want him to realise that actually he could have people in his leadership team that are LGBT who are not willing to come out because they feel that his CEO is a homophobe. So I don't know if there's policies that you create to try and, because I think a CEO has a responsibility to be on board with D&I if they're in business in the UK, because business plays a huge part in impacting what happens in society. And I think a lot of them do tend to understand, and I think there's been so much research now in D&I which explains the business case in terms of improved creativity, innovation, productivity, and increased competitive advantage. So if they don't get it, they're kind of missing out on opportunities perhaps.
Ruth?
I think if you're going to retain the European Convention on Human Rights and Parliamentary Sovereignty, rejigging and rearranging the deck chairs is a huge logistical nightmare that is best, I would say, untouched at this time when there's an awful lot going on, what with, the B word and everything. So my big advice, whatever comes out of this, I would just leave alone, to be honest, because we are where we are, and if we had a blank sheet of paper, I'm sure we could do all sorts of things, but it's doing all right for what we need it to do right now, and let's just carry on.
And I sort of re-echo what I said before, a lot less gender in our daily lives, because bizarrely I was interacting with the GEO, the Government Equalities Office, a couple of years back, and they were telling me how companies needed gender in order to market. What? That's a strange one. Less formality, which is coming out of the whole let's document gender, let's document name, let's document this, document that. and therefore fewer tick box barriers, because a lot of the barriers to trans people particularly, perhaps less so to LGBT, are barriers along the lines of do you fall into this category. And final plea is therefore associated with that much more practicality. Again, associated with the IT and the legal side. I write about security, I look at security, and it drives me absolutely bonkers when a bank says you have to do that because security. And one of the best instances is, and I've worked with Cabinet Office on their sort of IT thing, and their own IT people have said gender doesn't enhance security, it's one of the least useful things. And yet you will get people at international borders going, right, your passport says your name, your passport has your picture, but the gender marker, we don't quite think we like the gender marker. And it's absolute bonkers. What they're doing is they're picking up on the detail, and so we want practical security, and in fact can we just stop using security as a blanket way of shutting down debate on issues, because for trans people identity and authenticity is very much part of who we are, and in everyday life we're constantly being challenged to prove we are who we are, and an obsession with security does tend to play very much into undermining us.
One thing I'd just like to add, actually, just from hearing them both speak, is probably around boardroom diversity and representation. I think if you're a listed company, I think a lot of them tend to report on what their gender diversity breakdown is, and with the Parker Review, we've got the target now of trying to get ethnic minority diversity into the boardroom. It'd be great if you were a listed company, the company had to report on what their LGBT diversity was at board level. That doesn't mean that the person has to, it should be voluntary about whether they declare whether they're LGBT or not, but at least being able to ask the question and trying to capture the data. At least then we have a sense of actually how LGBT the boardroom is right now, with a view of then perhaps maybe having a target for LGBT as well in the future. So that's probably one thing I'd suggest.
Great. Okay, very interesting. Thank you to all of you for coming along and sharing your thoughts and your time. Very useful. We're going to a policy formulation stage now, so we'll be thinking about all the various ideas and hope to have a final report in the spring, as I mentioned. But please do keep in touch with us, share ideas. We might bat ideas back with you. But yes, thank you very much for coming.